It seems like the 1st of March was a very long time ago. None of us had ever lived through a quarantine and pandemic before. Now we are 3 months into it. Things are opening up, sort of, but even as things come back online, much will be very different. Certainly, it feels uncomfortable. Your life has changed since March 1st. Life before that was going on as it always had. Things were routine. Then it all stopped. All of us felt that change in not being able to assemble as the church in our usual place. So, how have you coped? What have these present circumstances taught us? Each of us has developed in himself the motto of the Roman soldiers: You might bend me, but you will never break me. We've learned to be flexible. We have come into a newfound gift of time. Have you used it as a spiritual opportunity? Do you now have a deeper consideration of those who are alone and those who are in need? We know that church is more than what happens on Sunday in a building. You know, we as the Church of Christ in South Holland might just be at our very best right now. Members are being checked on. We are seeking to meet others' needs. My thinking is that when we return to assembling, we will never go back as before. I don't mean that we will always be very cautious about how we physically interact with one another. Certainly, we will for a while. But there is more. We will be more conscious of each other. Family will have a deeper meaning. I hope to see all of you again soon. Things will be different, but that will be a good thing. I love my church family. Firefighters came to the rescue of a New Jersey man who became stuck in a tree while trying to reach his pet bird. News had told us that his scarlet macaw had fled the coop late on Thursday night. The man spent the next 20 hours trying to find his pet. The screeching bird was finally located by him on Friday at the top of a tree about a block away. Neighbors called 911 after this gentleman had climbed the tree with the help of a 20-foot ladder and got to his feathered friend, but he couldn't climb back down. Firefighters had to cut dozens of branches to get their ladder and rescue bucket close to him. And so finally, the man and his bird were pulled into the bucket. This phrase, up a tree, is used figuratively to portray someone at the fork of the road in his life, needing to decide which way to go. The correct way might seem very clear, but there are influences in a person's life which might cause them to hesitate in deciding which fork to take. Perhaps you are now up a tree, and even though the correct road to take seems clear, yet there are other factors you are considering which make both ways look inviting. Consider these four men who were up a tree and consider the choices they made. Do you remember Absalom? Absalom was the son of David, one of his sons. Absalom had killed his brother because of a crime that the brother had committed against his own sister, against Absalom's sister. And Absalom just waited a couple of years and then killed him, and then fled from his father David. He was fearful for his own life. Uh, he fled to the northern kingdom, finally was invited by David to come back, though David had nothing to do with his son Absalom. Absalom, though, regarded the kingship as something that he wanted very, very much. And so he plotted and schemed to have David killed and himself put up as the king of the combined nation of Judah and Israel. David eventually, with his forces, fought against Absalom, and Absalom fled because he and his troops were losing. In fleeing, you remember the story of how Absalom got his head stuck in a tree, and then the commander of David's army, Joab, came and pierced him through. And then Joab's army soldiers came after that and killed him. Absalom was a man who wasted his blessings. He had everything going for him. Absalom's father was King David. Absalom's wife was the daughter of a king of another nation. So Absalom could possibly have been in a position to become king himself. He certainly had uh, many rights to do that, very privileged, but he wasted his privileges. In wasting his privileges, he wasted also his birthright. It's interesting that Paul tells us in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, that even some disciples of Jesus wasted their potential. He said that there were two of them specifically who had made shipwreck of their faith. Think of those in that first century who were eyewitnesses of miracles being done, people being healed and raised from the dead, and then turning away from their faith. They had everything going for them. We wish sometimes we even had that today to be able to see some of those things. Though we know we walk by faith, not by sight, as Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Absalom had everything going for him, but he wasted all of it. All of it. Judas is another individual who rejected the Son of God forever. You remember Judas. He was the one who betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. He was the one who led the mob into the dark of night at the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives and identified Jesus with a kiss. You remember Judas as a man who ended up hanging himself. Judas rejected the call of Jesus and rejected the Son of God forever. In Matthew 11:28, Jesus said to all, and that included Judas, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Can you imagine Judas being there at the resurrection of Lazarus, as John records it in chapter 11? Lazarus, who had been dead 4 days, and when Jesus says, "Lazarus, come forth," there was not one person there other than Jesus who was not surprised at Lazarus coming out of the grave. Judas saw that and still rejected the Son of God forever. When I think of Judas, I think of one of the men who was in the boat. Matthew records this in chapter 14, verse 25. Jesus comes to them walking on the water. In spite of all this, in spite of all of this, he rejected the call of the Lord. In John 3:16, It was Jesus who said, uh, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." Can you imagine Judas hearing that and saying no? Luke records for us in Acts chapter 4, verse 12, that there is no salvation apart from Jesus. It is in the name of Jesus that salvation comes. It is through Jesus that people will be saved, and in that name and in that name only. Judas rejected the Messiah, betraying Jesus for money, closed the door on his own soul. Judas thought that he had profited 30 pieces of silver, but without Christ he had nothing. To refuse, you understand this now, to refuse to become a Christian is a rejection of Christ. Judas was up a tree. He had a decision to make, and he said no to Jesus. Ah, Zacchaeus. Who doesn't know the story of Zacchaeus and that precious little song that the children learned of Zacchaeus climbing up a tree? And this is literally, of course, Luke tells us this in chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. Zacchaeus knew that Jesus was coming, but he was a wee little man. He was small, but he wanted to see Jesus. And the interesting thing about it is that if we so desire, we too will find him. Jesus said, "Ask and it will be given, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened." Zacchaeus had a clear call from Christ. I love his response. He had promised to give several fold back to those from whom he had taken way too much money as a tax collector. He would return it all to them. His life changed drastically. And when his life changed, he saw himself and he saw others differently. Zacchaeus made that choice. Finally, of course, consider Jesus Christ and his redemption of our souls. Paul in Galatians chapter 3 verse 13 says that Jesus redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. Cursed is everyone who hangs upon a tree is an Old Testament passage that Paul quoted. Christ became a curse for us, and in so doing, he redeemed our souls. This is the one who at his baptism in Matthew 3:17, this is the one of whom the Father in heaven said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. This is the Son in whom I delight. This is my boy, and I like him. He will always choose correctly." Jesus had a choice to make, and he chose correctly. You know, we make many poor choices in our lives. There isn't any one of us who doesn't wish he could go back and undo a direction that he or she went and wish we could make a better choice. We will always do that. But this must not be one of those poor choices to turn away from Christ. He brought about the redemption of our souls. When I think of these four men, I think all four of them ended up a tree because of their choices. Absalom chose rebellion against his father and died a shameful death. Judas chose betrayal and died an ugly death at his own hands. Zacchaeus started out in a tree and died a happy, glorious death to sin. Jesus ended up on a tree to die a shameful, painful death so that we could live forever. Here's an interesting story in Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 through 7 that I alluded to as I began this lesson. Let me share these verses with you. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it." Cain came to a point in his life where he had a choice. Each of us has a choice. And the question comes, what do you choose? What do you choose? Thank you for listening and for being here. God bless.